So we're really lucky to be joined by Andy Crabb again today. He is one of the archaeologists for Dartmoor National Park Authority, and it's his responsibility to help look after all of our ancient monuments across Dartmoor and try and keep those cared for and looked after. So without further ado, I am going to pass you over to Andy Crabb and let Andy tell you a bit more about what's going to happen this afternoon. Andy.
Okay, thank you, Andy, for that introduction. As well as looking after all the sites, I'm also lucky enough to get involved with local volunteer groups and increase our understanding about new sites and push forward the boundaries of our knowledge. And this is the case what I'm going to talk about today with the North Hall Manor site. And so without further ado, I will go on to my slideshow. So I'd like to start with this gentleman here. This is a legendary character called Peter Reynolds, who is the impetus behind the North Hall Manor dig and all the documentary research and setting up the project in the first place. It must be about 25, 24 years ago now that the Widecombe History Group, the local amateur history group, looking after Widecombe District, formed. And Peter Reynolds was a key member of that. And at their first meeting, inevitably in the local pub, they were figuring out what projects they were going to do and what research areas they were going to investigate. And so Peter was always intrigued with the first edition OS map. And here it is here. You can see the 1886 OS map showing Widecombe. You can see the church of St Pancras, the famous cathedral of the Moors, and the road coming down the steep hill from Bovey Tracy, and the other roads coming up from Ashburton, all meeting around the village green, the famous village green. But what attracted Peter's attention was this in italics here in very antiquarian script. It says North Hall, the site of, with a fantastic cross marking it. And it fired his imagination, because when he referred to the Domesday book, we knew that there are 4 manors referred to in Domesday, in the 1086 version, in Widecombe. There's Spitchwick, Natsworthy, Dunstan and Blackslade, but no mention of North Hall. So that was really intriguing. So that set Peter on a quest. And Peter started looking for evidence. And after getting permission from the landowner, he went out and looked at this site. This was the site. This is the field where that cross is located. And I'll just describe it to you. So this is the site. This is the location of that cross on the first edition OS map. And you can see a mound with our old education officer standing on top of it. And behind him, a range of 1950s farm buildings, which are in a rather worse state of wear. But if you look at the foreground, you can see a line of rushes in a very boggy area of ground, and off camera to the right, this actually turns into a really nice defined and deep water channel. This was the site, as I was mentioning, but it could be the site of the manor house. It's one of the only dry bits of land in the valley floor, and just behind on the right hand side is the church. We would have seen the church tower towering over the scene if the camera just panned round to the right a bit. Now, Peter also did most of the documentary research for about 15 years before we actually did any archaeology, and he found all other sources of evidence as well, which kind of demonstrate how the site, although there's no trace of it standing above ground, survived in the local memory. You can see a poem there on the left-hand side from the local poet policeman of Widecombe, Webber, from 1878, and other documentary evidence as well includes the engraving from 1770 of a view looking at St Pancras Church, and we've highlighted a building which was shown in the background of the engraving of a large kind of farmhouse type structure right on the site of where that previous photo was taken. Other clues around the site were bits of fantastically worked granite artefacts like window mullions, bits of dressed stone. The edge of that ditch I mentioned seemed to have large dressed granite stones protruding from it. And the site was also known by local farmers as a place to go and get stone for building activity as well. And as you saw from that last slide, that area was a farmyard, a working farmyard, up until about 1990. So as Peter worked through the documents, he managed to establish links for the first references to Widecombe and mentions of North Hall Manor appearing at around 1230, 1240, associated to someone called Fitzralph, son of Ralph, and how they set up the manor and set up St Pancras Church, which you can see on the image to the south there. And slowly acquiring all this information and all this evidence about the manor house, so Peter managed to attract the attention of local and prominent archaeologists such as Roger Waterhouse, who did a walkover survey. And he annotated the first edition OS map with some features he thought gave weight to the argument that there was a manor house here. Let's start with number 1. That's the top of the flat top mound. And when Roger was walking over the site in the summer, he saw grass marks of a rectangular building. Surrounding the site, number 6 and number 7, he believed was the course of a moat. Now this is quite unique for Devon. We don't have many moated manor houses. They're more a phenomena of the southeast of England and the Midlands as well. So this could have been really interesting. Was this a proper moat, or was it some type of elaborate storage system for one of the many mills which Widecombe is home to? Also quite convincing was number 3. I'll just get my pointer here. This is a link across the watercourse down a sunken lane, or as you can see from the key, an allée d'honneur, a kind of secret path or formal avenue really between the manor house and the church. Now those of you who have studied medieval history and English village history will know the intricate and very strong relationship between the church and the manor house. Many churches were established with the financial help of the local lord to increase their prestige and their spiritual well-being as well. Other features you can see in number 5 is the outer enclosure, we think, of the manor house. And can you see how these field boundaries and this watercourse here almost makes an outer boundary focused on our site number 1 as well? Okay. Right, sorry. So, with all this evidence being accrued, 2 fortuitous things happened. Firstly, we had some money available in the National Park to fund the Widecombe History Group to do a geophysical survey of this area. And also the land ownership changed as well. New landowners came on, and the new farmers were very, very keen and very interested in the history of their farm. And they allowed, thanks to their new agri-environment scheme, to help to dig up some trenches targeted across this mound, which focused on the signals and the kind of interesting features which were revealed by the geophysical survey. So we started in that very wet summer of 2012. And as you can see, there's not much soil on the site, and it became apparent we only had a week to dig. We came down and encountered lots and lots of rubble, lots of granite rubble everywhere. And up here, this gentleman here is actually standing on the natural granite bedrock. And we were getting a bit concerned that nothing much survived here. And what we thought were archaeological features were in fact just reflections from the electromagnetic signals used by the geophysics, reflecting off the granite bedrock. However, as the week wore on, other clues started to appear. Underneath the rubble, we started to find this cut feature, which we believed to be a post hole for supporting a timber. When we carefully analysed the pottery, so we realised some of it was in fact medieval pottery. This is a type of pottery called Totnesware, which is kind of very common and coarse, rough everyday tableware, indicative of the kind of 12th, 13th and 14th centuries. And believe it or not, this bottom slide here is taken when the rubble was stripped off and we actually found the foundation courses of a wall. So we're getting quite excited. We had some tentative evidence now. There was once a structure on this site. And it's not surprising really that nothing much survives. And this was a working farmyard up until about the 1990s, as I said. And in the section of this photograph here, it's all the same material. You'll be finding bits of plastic, bits of Massey Ferguson tractor, as well as the medieval and later pottery. So it's all mixed up. There's no stratigraphy. None of those individual strands and threads of history which archaeologists and historians can unpick to work out the history of the site. But features were surviving. And when we looked at the pottery even closer, we started to realise some of this pottery is really quite important and really quite high status. This rather a braided fragment here turned out to come from Spain, Islamic Spain in the 14th and 15th century, a really bit of high status tableware called Valencian Lustreware. And this is what it would have looked like. Here's an example of lustreware for I think, from Exeter Museum. And what's really intriguing about this site is how on earth did this get to rural Dartmoor in the 14th and 15th century? Who had the power and the wealth to import it? You normally only ever find this type of pottery in central Exeter or at Sutton Harbour, our urban centres of the period. And these are some other finds. On the top left-hand corner, you can see a handmade ridge tile. Again, who could afford to put roof slates and roof tiles on their house in this period? A bit of stained glass window with a window lead around it, probably from the 15th or early 16th century. In the bottom left-hand corner, our resident metal detectives found a French coin. All of this was unstratified, unfortunately. It was being turned up with bits of granny's teapots, bits of plastic, etc. So we couldn't really have anything to date. We just knew there was a presence there of early medieval and later medieval activity going on. Another pottery we were finding included this rather fine stoneware, which comes from the Rhine Valley in Germany and the Low Countries. And these are some nice examples of some 16th century Bellarmine jugs. Again, normally found in an urban context. So we were acquiring quite a body of evidence that there was once upon a time quite a high status settlement here. And then we hit pay dirt. This was after the main dig had finished, and I went back to finish off a trench. And that watercourse feature I mentioned going all the way around the site, we noticed had on the internal side a raised bank of earth. And we were really excited by that because underneath we found sealed features. And you can just see down here a small ditch. And this turned out to be one of the predominantly early boundary ditches around the site, which predated that larger watercourse I mentioned. And from the fill of this ditch, we were able to find some pottery. And it doesn't look like much, but this is a really rare type of pottery. This is a North French barrel Costrel from about 1250, give or take. And only one example has ever been found in Exeter in South Street in the back of a merchant's house. And I think actually there was some found in Plymouth as well, in Sutton as well. But to find this in a rural context means there's a high status family living here, someone who could import wine from the continent to entertain themselves and their guests. And importantly, this came from a sealed deposit. We've got a chronology developing here. This is what that North French barrel Costrel would have looked like. This example, I think, came from Exeter. Okay, so round about this time as well, we were lucky that our application for the Moor meets the eye NFL Landscape Heritage Partnership project, sorry, it's a real mouthful, was successfully awarded a large grant. And the Widecombe History Group put forward the North Hall Manor project, and it was adopted. And so we got additional funding to return to the site and explore some of those features we had found in 2012. In the background, we opened up this trench on the wall I showed in that previous photograph. And we're just getting the wall fittings now of a foundation course, and coming down the trench, more cut features, a couple of post holes and a possible beam trench as well. Evidence for buildings are appearing on top of that mound. But we dug for about 6 years, and despite the problems of digging on the site, the truncated nature of the deposits and the haphazard deposition of the artefacts, we did kind of produce quite a few features, or find a few features. And this is an aerial drone image one of our volunteers took of our large open areas. As the funding increased, so we could increase the number of volunteers we had on site and the areas we could examine. And this is the end result. So it's fairly successful to date. And now I'm going to go into a bit more detail about actually what we found and try to tell a story of how this site developed. Okay, so based on that North French barrel Costrel, we think the site was established in the early 13th century, probably around the 1230s to 1240s. You'll recall we're on top of a mound here, so we always had it in the back of our mind that there may have been an earlier settlement here. This is a nice bit of dry ground and a wet valley bottom. And as you know, on Dartmoor, we've got lots of prehistoric activity, but we couldn't ascertain that any of the cut features or post holes we found belonged to an earlier period. We did find some 11th, possibly 10th century pottery as well, some Saxon type of pottery. And that was really exciting, but that didn't come from any secure deposit. So we stripped back the area here, and you can just start to see some of the different patterns and colorations in the soil which archaeologists love. And these are our buried features. We've got some post holes being excavated over here and some linear trenches running at 90 degrees to each other across the site. Okay, it has gone forward. And on excavation, we revealed this large dog leg feature, and you can see these post holes, 4 in an arrangement here and some more on the end of the trench. The trouble in archaeology is you never get the full picture. Your trench always needs to be a further metre to the west or to the east or whatever direction it may be. But we're just starting to get enough now to start to tell a story. And this is what it looked like in plan. So the orange boundary you can see, which my highlighter is showing, is we think the first ditch and bank around the site. And these dashes are our excavation trenches. And this is the dog leg feature I showed, and you can see the circular post holes. And what we think we've got here is a very early building. I told you the evidence was very slight. And from excavated examples elsewhere in the country, this arrangement of posts sometimes suggests a cooking area, a smoke hood. And often buildings for cooking and heating activities are separate from the main dwelling house. And we think the main dwelling house, even though no evidence survives for this period, was located on top of the mound, which is in this area. And down below, we've got this earlier timber building demarked by these post holes. And we had a line of post holes coming up the slope. And in some more better examples where preservation is better, you often get a pentis, a covered walkway, linking the service block to the main hall as well. So the meals were brought in hot. And on Dartmoor, you would have needed that to shield the food or whatever it was being brought up into the main hall from Dartmoor's notorious weather. And it was in this trench, in the fields, we found the evidence for that north barrel French Costrel. So we think this is early 12th century. And based on this, we got a reconstruction drawing done. And you can see the wooden structures here, linked together by a pentis, a service block, possible chimney, possible kitchen, service area, and the main hall and the earlier ditch around. But this ties into a nice period of Dartmoor and for Widecombe. When we start to get mention of Widecombe itself, I've mentioned this guy Fitzralph, and it seems like he was keen to develop a manor in the area. Widecombe's also mentioned for the first time about 40 years before, when some residents of Widecombe had been rather naughty and had done some illegal clearance of the waste. It's a crime called wasto, and they got fined 12 shillings because they were clearing trees in the royal forest. I'm sure many of you know Dartmoor Forest's origins go back to a royal hunting ground, and around about the beginning of the 12th century, 13th century, population pressure in England and the drier climate opened up areas which previously couldn't be cultivated, open to exploitation. And we think that this guy, because of the population pressure and probably through an award of a grant of land for loyal service, was given this part of Widecombe to develop. And then the name North Hall, which we get a reference to later in the period, could have come from the fact that the site is to the north of Dunstan Manor, which is about 2 kilometres to the south. We're north of that site. The other reason for the name of North Hall could be because we're north of the church. And you can see this fledgling church just developing to the south. But this enclosure, the building this enclosure in the churchyard, is also referenced in the document as well, where residents of the neighbouring manor were told to go and help construct the churchyard. So it seems like the focus in Widecombe is starting to shift to this new settlement. It's a well-connected site and it's well watered. And when you've got water, you can build a mill and you can start charging people to use your mill. And obviously on Dartmoor as well, new technologies are coming in for tin streaming and the processing of tin, and that tin trade is just starting to take off. So this area could be seen for a keen investor as an area of opportunity. And in this photograph, this image, you can see lots of strip fields in the background, very reminiscent of the feudal system at the time. So that's what we think was happening in phase 1 of the site. Very conjectural, I understand. And also the documentary evidence is very, very slight. Peter did some brilliant work on the documentary evidence, and that was backed up by Dr. David Stone of Exeter University. But we found more features as well to add to our flavour. And here, archaeological pay dirt, you can see intercutting features. So we've got more than one phase of activity, one overlying the other. We've almost got chronology developing. And it looked like by the end of the late 13th century, we're getting a whole new range of timber buildings developing. As the site prospered and developed, and the old wooden timbers rotted away, so they needed to replace those, and as their economic output increased, so they could afford to invest more in their holding. And the next phase is building B in the top left-hand corner, these parallel curvilinear features. And these are quite a common feature of the Welsh border forts, the ring forts, where timber buildings are constructed off the earlier boundary ditch. And this earlier boundary ditch carries all the way around the site, but it looks like it was redug. You can see the profile regrades in this slide here, and it seems like a building was constructed across this area, across our earlier building A. And elsewhere on the site we found arrangements of post holes. In such a concentration it was hard to make a plan. They could have just been replacing the posts of a building as they rotted out, or remodelling the buildings. The pattern wasn't clear at all, unfortunately. And a lot of these features had 14th century and late 13th century pottery within them. And this is what it looked like on plan. Here's our curvilinear feature, our building B, overlying the earlier building we think could be a possible kitchen. It may be this building was still in use. And all those post holes occurred in this area, and that's been interpreted as another rough area of a building. The fence line, I'm in the kind of disagreement with the archaeologists on this one. I think there was a later building across here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit of a while. So you can see we're getting rough tentative evidence of the site developing through that 13th and 14th century period. And along the Pentice, this area of covered walkway, we came across some recut post holes as well, which luckily contained later pottery in as well. So we're getting good evidence of these posts being replaced. So this is our kind of artistic reconstruction to site. You can see how it's developed. A curvilinear building has been built around the perimeter of the site. The Pentice is still there. We've possibly got another area in the centre of the site. And you can see the economic activity is starting to pick up. Widecombe's prospering as a result of this input from the new lord, the agricultural boom which is going on, and probably the tin trade and the revenue that's bringing. Okay, now things get even better, and we got very excited. This is the first wall we found. That bit in the first slide I showed you of the wall foundation was in fact these blocks here, and it turned into this rather large wall foundation, which we think is in fact remains of a chimney with a chimney with a half slab in the bottom. The granite bedrock is so high they didn't have to build construction trenches. Indeed, it looked like they levelled off a lot of the granite gravel, all the grown, where they could, to provide a nice level foundation trench. And the walls went off in this direction as well to a possible outhouse or another entranceway. But it just shows you how little survives, and we got excited about this. Just about half a metre, if we're lucky, of rough foundation course. A lot of the stonework was probably robbed off for the other buildings in Widecombe. Is everyone okay? Andy, is everything all right? I can hear some buzzing. Okay, I'm just.
Yeah, no, everything's okay.
Cool.
I've still got your microphones on, so if you have got your microphone, just unmute it. But yeah, no, everything's going okay from this side. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so we were really excited about this. Really excited indeed. And this is what it looked like in plan in yellow. Oh, sorry. Trigger happy finger. You can see down the bottom here that large slab, which we think was part of a fireplace, the internal bit of a fireplace. The only bit of internal surfacing surviving on site from this period. No other floor slabs, no other nicely compressed clay floors or anywhere else on site. It seems like it was comprehensively looted for building materials at later dates. And you can see the arrangement of walls heading north-south across the site, and we're right on top of the mound here, the most prominent site for your hall or your main residence to be. Anywhere around on Widecombe Valley, you'd be able to see this building from the surrounding common lands, and you'll be able to see out across your demesne lands and across your own lands as well. Later on in the dig, we found another little bit, the return of this building, we think, here as well. The return wall. So quite a large building. And there it is in relation to the rest of the site. We've still got the boundary ditches going around and the elements of our stonework. This area, we think, that area of where we think was a possible kitchen, so that always became a stone building as well. That site was developed, but we're not sure if this belongs to phase 3 or phase 4. There is a stone building there. And I'll just talk about that as we go on. So here we are, the wealth of Widecombe's and the Lord's Manor is really starting to kick in, and so they can start to build in stone, a much more durable building material than wood, obviously. But predominantly most of the service buildings are probably still timber as well. Maybe that's why they're not showing up archaeologically as well. We start to get better documentary evidence now. This belongs to the family of the Shillingfords, and they were well connected. They owned, as well as North Hall, Shillingford Manor and Farringdon Manor as well. They're a high status family. Various branches of the family served as the Mayor of Exeter over several periods, over several terms of office, and one of them was the Dean of the Exeter Cathedral as well. They also had holdings down near Topsham, and it seems like they got a lot of their money from the trade of importing wine from the continent as well. So it looks like they're investing some of their money into developing North Hall and St Pancras Church as well. And around about this period, we're starting to get a shift away from an agricultural-based economy based on arable crops to one more based on the wool trade and the wool industry as well. Towns like Buckfastleigh and Ashburton are starting to develop. And so some of those previous strip fields you can see have been taken out of cultivation, they've been enclosed and they've been handed over to pastoral activities as well. And of course, on Dartmoor, the tin streaming industry is really starting to kick off. So a successful family investing in North Hall, and we think a minor branch of the family were living here, and that may have provided the impetus for them to keep up with the Joneses, as it were, and build this nice stone manor house here as well. But the site really reaches its climax, we think, in the late 15th century. We start to find more stone buildings when we were digging across off the mound, and we think the moat, that very large moat, was developed here. Some of the features we've got in the top left-hand corner, we've got a stone wall heading across the earlier boundary and projecting out into the moat. We think this could be a guardhouse, a guardrobe, or something using the water from the moat. And these happy students down the bottom left-hand corner, after a week of just maticking away rubble and demolition, did find some in situ surviving masonry of a wall, which is the return of this top-hand building here as well. And here's my colleague who had the unenviable task of staying out in the horsefly-infested moat to ascertain, the horsefly-infested marsh, to ascertain where the moat went. It survived as a good ditch to the present day to the north of the site. Indeed, it's just behind these chaps here. But as it goes off to the right, we soon lose it. And he's auguring and finding deposits. Now, the construction of a moat is really interesting because there are only in Devon about 5 or 6 known moats, and they mainly occur in the east of the country. Moats are normally, as I mentioned, a kind of more east of England and Midlands phenomena. It was a kind of a fashion statement. You could afford to invest in a moat. You could afford to separate your manor house from everyone else. You could make it a special area. And so to find this is really quite unique for Dartmoor. And it was a huge feature. It's about 10 metres across, and we augured down to a depth of about 3.5 metres, and we weren't convinced we'd meet the bottom of it yet. But the moat could also serve a secondary purpose. It's a reliable source of water you could control, and it could use a secondary role as a mill pond, for example, to supply mills with water during the summer months when water is scarce. So these are our stone buildings. That's the one I was just talking about up here, a possible guardrail projecting out into the and crossing the earlier boundary ditch. And we think maybe that the manor may have been redeveloped and we had stone ranges forming this quad all the way around. Now there's a lot of conjecture on this, and this kind of relates to a document which is written about in the 1890s when a local historian references a chap called Prideaux, an unsourced document where this chap Prideaux in the Tudor period relates how when he was a child he got sent away to North Hall Manor to escape the plague. He lived in Totnes, and to escape the plague coming back on the Winefleet, so he was sent into the middle of Dartmoor. And he described going to North Hall Manor, and he described this large complex centred around a stone building with ranges of barns and stores and a guardhouse and beer cellars and sorting vats and a wide moat around the site. And most of these stories probably have a grain of truth in. And when you compare the other documentary sources we get, later bills of sale of the site, which mention a moat and a watercourse, grist mills as well, there's probably likely that this was the site of a once fairly small but quite elaborate manor house. So our reconstruction drawing has drawn all these strands together, archaeological and documentary, and you can see the result here. There's our chimney where the half-stone survived, butting out, with the stone building going off. Most of it's all truncated. Possibly the other building we found is this structure here, and the large moat, 10 metres across, going around the site. The source from the possible Tudor source mentions herb gardens and the courtyard as well, so we've put those in, and they mention orchards. And the orchards, some of them still survive on site to this day. There's some very old orchards in the area, so they've been put in as well to try and bring that documentary evidence alive. And it just kind of, as well as being a kind of visual representation of what the site might have looked like, it's bringing together all those other strands of research to kind of build a picture together. And if you look at the surrounding landscape, it's now almost predominantly pastoral, livestock based on the booming wool trade. The church has been rebuilt, the tower has been built as well, before it collapses, of course, in the next century, and the church house, which still stands to this day, has been constructed. So the site has reached its pinnacle now, and this could coincide with proper evidence of the site going from being sold from the Shillingfords to the Huddersfield estate and onto the Carews as well, two very large, prominent, well-connected families. But that's it for North Hall. Things start to take a turn for the worse. Many of these lords and high-status families had many holdings, and North Hall was always probably on the peripheral. And it may be that it was developed to this extent to provide a summer retreat. We've got slight evidence of that, conjectural evidence of that from that document source I mentioned from from Prideaux. And that maybe that grain of truth it kind of suggests that this was a summer residence. It was being somewhere to entertain your guests in the summer. How better to show off your Tudor wealth and status than following the fashion trends of the day by putting a moat around your site? There's one thing Widecombe isn't short of, and that's water, that's for sure. So there we go. Moving on though, the site starts to decay. It stops to become a kind of primary residence or a summer residence, and we get leases appearing in the 16th and 17th century of being subleased out to local farmers. And we get descriptions surviving of tumble-down mills, tumble-down manor houses. The remains of a stately house is another phrase which props up. And this is where most of our archaeological evidence comes from, this large spread of demolition. It basically became like a big recycling yard of its day. Even though Widecombe was booming at the time, this site itself became of less importance to the owners, and they were selling buildings off maybe, or allowing people to come in to steal the stone to develop their own farmhouses and their own properties in the neighbouring areas. And indeed, this tradition carried on to the 20th century. It was well known that a farmer came down on site and actually told me that their porch of their farm and the neighbouring farm was constructed out of stone, pulled out of the ground at North Hall. There's no wonder we weren't finding much in the way of in situ archaeology. And the spread of this material was all over the site. And the evidence from the moat suggests that it wasn't infilled in one go, it gradually silted up. But then it had a final flourish, North Hall. It seemed like that mound, that dry site was too good to go to waste, and in the late 18th and 19th centuries, a little farm built up on that site again. The origins of the current glebe farm as it's known today. And we found a nice paved and cobbled courtyard and a range of farm buildings, which in turn were later robbed out, with a bit of flooring. You can see some flooring here, and a range of a farm building running off with some post holes. You can see a robbed out wall here as well. And when we first excavated this, we thought this might be Tudor remains, but we think it's a lot later now. And that is really the end of the archaeological story. There's that later building, there. And this is when we start to get into modern mapping evidence. I say modern mapping, I am a prehistorian after all. But in 1799, this had become Lord Ashburton's estate, and he mapped the area, and he produced an estate map, and you can see buildings on top of the mound, and the possible remains of the silted up moat as well being shown, and the watercourses around the site. And we think we have found this building here, or it could be this one. It's more likely to be this one. And that was the last phase of activity on the site before it became a modern farmyard. And this orchard here, the five-sided orchard to the north, is still standing and has been dated to about 300 years old. So we're getting these kind of living links back to the past as well. So that was a rather rushed through explanation of the hunt for North Hall Manor. It's been a really fantastic project to be involved and help the local community develop their own ideas through to fruition, and add greatly to our understanding of both the formation of medieval Widecombe, the famous medieval Widecombe village. Looks like it was established as a result of North Hall being established in the 12th and 13th centuries, and increasing our understanding of medieval Dartmoor generally. So thank you, and I'll hand you back to Andy now. And if you've got any questions, do